It's really an honor for me to introduce our speaker today. Real quickly, I've known Stu Richards for decades. He has had a long career in healthcare. He started off with his undergraduate degree from Brigham Young University, got his PA degree from George Washington University, and then went on to get a master's in the healthcare system and management from the University of San Francisco, and master's in PA studies in ER medicine at University of Nebraska. Interestingly enough, he served most of early on in his life. He was a U.S. Navy corpsman, basically involved in sea air rescue with tours at Miramar and aboard the USS Kitty Hawk. And later on went into the United States Public Health Service and worked at Phoenix Indian Medical Center, and retired in 2006 as a Captain 06. Having nothing to do at that time, he decided to do something even more exciting and went into the State Department as a Foreign Service medical practitioner from 2011 to 2018. And he'll tell you more about that, but he has been to over 68 countries, many countries including Mongolia, Africa, Madagascar, Pakistan, and Iraq. And in the short time that we have, I'm hoping he'll share with you some of his experiences in Islamabad. So Mr. Stu Richards, it's all yours. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Randy, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to come here and talk. I get tired of having to do really formal talks, and it was nice for Randy to say this could be very informal. So if there's any questions, anytime, just ask away. Don't be afraid to interrupt. It's a subject that is very big, and so I'm not actually sure how to encapsulate it into just maybe 20, 25-minute talk, but let me give it a shot. And what I'd like to do, if I can get my slides up here, sorry. Well, Randy, can you see those?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so the slides are there. Okay, so I'd like to do is start off with just a very brief overview of the State Department structure. And I'm sure lots of people know this, so if I'm being redundant, just let me know. But a lot of people don't. And to be honest, myself, I didn't really. So the State Department is a worldwide organization, and it is primarily a foreign service. So people who enter the State Department have to agree to worldwide assignments. And the first one or two assignments that you get in the State Department directs those assignments. They're called directed. After that, people start bidding for their assignments. Briefly, up until about the 1920s, 1930s, working for the State Department was not considered a career, and that people would come and go. About the 1930s and 40s, it started to become actually a career, and people started developing the long-term approach to their career and managing and going up the ladders competitively to becoming ambassadors and senior foreign service officials, and eventually maybe Secretary of State, but most of those are politically assigned. What happened was that as that career process developed, they had already enacted a law that required mandatory retirement at 65. And so that law is still in effect, and I'm 68. So I was actually aged out of my job in the State Department. And that law was put into effect when people were living in extremely isolated countries with very bad healthcare and very bad hardships, and age was an issue. Today, that's just not the case. The medical department in the state is now considered a bureau. It's huge. It's really quite big. And it just divided up this last couple months into two sections, in the medical section and the special operations section. And special operations kind of grew out of what we call priority service posts. This is Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq, Pakistan, and a lot of the world has become a high threat post. And so Will Walters is the physician in charge of that. He's out of the Army Special Forces. And they actually do a lot of our interventions. Today, if you have COVID and we need to bring you out of country, they'll fly in with their specially designed plane, their respirator, the ventilators, and they'll have their own crew and they'll take you out of country and that. So what we have today is an extremely different State Department than we had 20 or 30 years ago. And medical as a full-time physician job as medical director for the State Department didn't even develop until the 1950s and that. So, and ironically, having been a retired public health service officer, I had to give this talk in Jamaica. The first State Department physician was actually a US Public Health Service physician. Years ago, when people, diplomats per se, were overseas and they had illnesses, if there was a public health physician in those countries, they would actually see the State Department people. And that has it just shows you how much they've actually changed over the years. And that, so I put this is true, the world is our office. And when people talk about assignments, I always tell them be a little careful because assignments are broad. My first assignment was Mongolia, but I went to Russia, Korea, China, multiple countries and that. And so there's always this, Stu, can you do us a favor? So my first favor, which is kind of ironic, was going out the door at state. And Kathy Chasm called me in. She's a senior officer for the Medical Bureau, and she's got a great office overlooking the Kennedy Center. And she said, can you do us a favor? Well, having been a military officer for 17 years, I said, sure, what can I do? She goes, just go to Eritrea for us on your way to Mongolia. And I said, okay, but where is Eritrea? And that, so they didn't tell me it was the North Korea of Africa. And Isaias, the president, had been a dictator there for over 30 years. And when I got dropped off into Eritrea at 3 o'clock in the morning coming through Cairo, I asked the stewardess on the plane, where do you guys stay here? And she goes, oh, we don't. And I got off with my suitcase on the runway and walked into the place where the guy took my passport and he looked at it and he goes, oh, you're an American. And he threw it back at me. And that was my introduction to the State Department. Since then, it's been a wild ride. And so in the 7 active years I was there, I've actually now gone to 68 countries. I'm leaving next week to go to a 5-month assignment in Burma. And I leave from Burma probably, if it fits together, to do a 1-year assignment in Kabul. And that, so since I do emergency medicine as my specialty as a PA, I often get put in a lot of isolated hazardous duty assignments. So I'm looking forward to that. Anyhow, quick review. Again, this is the State Department building. The person who said we're lucky to live in America, I wholeheartedly agree with them. We live in Disneyland, regardless of the problems we deal with. We have an e-ticket ride, and if we don't know it, we're foolish, but we do. And that for all the yelling, screaming, and shouting that we do in most other countries, you would disappear. I just came back from Zimbabwe. I spent 6-8 weeks this summer covering Zimbabwe. The chief physician in Zimbabwe asked for a raise for the nurses and physicians there. The average nurse makes $1 per day. And he was kidnapped, beaten, almost to death, found a month later wandering down a road. And that was his answer to asking for a raise for the medical people there. We really do have it good. And that, so we have the right to scream and shout and complain, and that's okay. So here is the 7th floor of the State Department, where a lot of high-level people are met and a lot of functions go on. This is my graduating class. In Foreign Service, when you enter, no matter if you're a generalist, you go to the A100 course, but essentially if you're a specialist, you come through FSI, and that's the Foreign Service Institute. So you have your orientation, basic training there, and then from there you get your flag or your assignment to the country you're first sent out to. So, and I'm sure everybody knows the State Department's major function is foreign affairs, but I would say there's a lot more than that. There's a concept in the State Department called Chief of Mission. Chief of Mission is the person in charge of the country. Chief of Mission is usually the ambassador, but it can be the charge, since no ambassador serves in a country without a duly elected president. And So many countries, I was Madagascar, we had a military junta, we had no functional elected government for 3 years, and Eric Wong was our chargé. Normally, your ambassador has under him the deputy chief of mission, the DCM. And so often, if the ambassador is not there, the DCM will be the chargé. But under that concept of chief of mission comes all federal agencies in that country. So if you're in that country and you're at war, that country is ran by a military officer. And that when I was in Pakistan, our ambassador had a 3-star Air Force general who sat next to him. If we were at war, that general would probably be appointed in charge of that country. Other than that, it's the ambassador. And that means I'm sorry about the clock, but everybody who sits under that chief of mission is part of the medical department's responsibility. And that means everybody. And so it's huge. I mean, whether you're talking the FBI or any of the 3-letter agencies or DOD, defense attaches or whatever. So you have a large contingent of people. And this is kind of the structure of what's known as a country team. The country team basically is the ambassador's table that you sit at, and people along the wall who sit there who represent the heads of the agencies that they're in country. And every country may have different agencies depending upon the need of that country. If you're like I was in Mongolia, the US Treasury officer was there, and the US Treasury officer is there because Mongolia had come out from under the USSR in 1990. It had been bailed out by the World Bank 5 times, but with the massive mining operation, and they have $6 trillion of mineable ore in the ground, and they only have a country of 3 million people, they have a huge amount of potential revenue coming in, and they really needed guidance on how to manage it, how to do their bonds and all of that stuff. And so we had a Princeton grad who was a treasury officer at our country team. But we also had USAID in country. USAID is usually only in countries where there's a need, a third world country, a developing nation, so to speak. And then in those countries, we usually have the Peace Corps country director, the defense attaché, all of these people, econ, regional security, med. So it's a big job. It's a big team of people. When I was there, I got to meet Joe Biden. I got to meet, here's my wife meeting Hillary Clinton, and that she was Secretary of State at the time. So it's a big job. It's an interesting job, and there is a lot to be done. So one concept with state, which is really kind of critical, which I mean, it seems obvious, but you may not think about it, is people go away. DOD moves in with large contingents, hospitals, support systems, et cetera. State Department stays, DOD goes away. So when everybody goes away, unless we break diplomatic ties with the country, somebody from the State Department is there. And the best example of that was when I got to Eritrea and I found out we only had 10 Americans there. And there was 10 people and they sat constantly, all telephones were tapped. We had a person walking about a block away from us constantly. All the what we call locally employed staff or LES staff are required every month to report to the security officer of that country what's going on in our embassy. So they're very, very nice people. And a lot of these people have no choice, and the Eritreans had no choice. So they know that they have to report, and we know that we only let them see what we want them to see, and that's it. So it's a very unique kind of unique job with a lot of different opportunities. I have to say I had no idea of what I would wind up getting to see or do. And let's focus that on Pakistan. And I'll try to run through this quickly. But if you have any questions, please just stop and let me answer them as we go along, because you'll tend to forget them as we go. I just want to say one thing, that Med as a department is broken up into basically 3 levels. You have a regional medical officer who may have his own country or may be in charge of 5, 6, 7, 8 countries. And that officer will actually oversee maybe a nurse practitioner or PA at an embassy. When I was in Zimbabwe, I covered for the regional medical officer, and I had 5 countries. When I was myself in Madagascar, I was a solo provider, and I had the Comoran Islands and Mauritius to cover. So I had 3 countries I had to cover and do travel to. So that structure is augmented by what we call medevac centers. And that medevac center was Pretoria, South Africa, Singapore, and London, and then Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So we medevac people up to a higher level of care. So we ensure that if there's critical care, that they're at least at a comparable standard of care of the United States. And so in those areas, we have basically regional medical managers, and those managers manage an entire district. And it may be all of South Africa, all of Asia, all of Europe, and that. So we have about 5 regional medical managers throughout the entire world, but we have 260 consulates, embassies, and missions that we have to staff. So it's a pretty big organization in that regard. So I'll skip all the details of what MED does, but let me say this one thing, that MED is also totally responsible for everybody who comes to post. So you wind up having a large contingency of people. These are called congressional visitors. Senator, I took care of John McCain when he came to Pakistan. You have that on top of what's called diplomatic diplomacy to take care of. And so we do funding of people from all over the world to go back to the US to see special programs. You can design and develop them. And those are called IVLP, or International Visitor Leadership Programs, where people you think that are countrywide leaders at a certain level of an emerging technology that needs to see or be kind of introduced into another level, we can introduce those through the IVLP program and send them back to the US. So you can do a lot of things that are very good for the country besides being direct caregivers. And again, let me know when I'm going to run short, but I'm going to run down through Pakistan. And I want to kind of explain, I spent 2 years. Normally these are called hardship tours, and that we only do a year, but I was actually asked to stay. And I'm really glad I did, because there was a couple things that happened that I was glad I was there for. But Pakistan as a country, if you'll just look at the map and realize it borders with Iran, it borders with Afghanistan, it borders with China, it borders with India. I can say this with no doubt, it is probably one of the most strategic countries in the world that we deal with, between Russia, China, and India. What goes on there is amazing. The ambassador I served with, I'll show you a picture of him pretty soon here. He was David Hale. He's now the acting he's the Undersecretary of State for Politics. He actually testified in the impeachment trial about Trump, if you watched any of those testimonies. Incredible guy. I'll look down through here. Here's David. I got to be very good friends with him. I have great respect for this man. He had spent 20 years in the Middle East. He speaks fluent Arabic, Urdu. He was ambassador to Jordan. He was ambassador to Lebanon, and he'd been ambassador to Pakistan. And he said publicly, so I could repeat this, he said, the reason we're in Pakistan, the reason we will not leave Pakistan is because they have nuclear weapons. And that is true. So Pakistan started out, being subdivided into East Pakistan and West Pakistan. West Pakistan became the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. So it's definitely an Islamic nation, though they do have tolerance for other religions. East Pakistan eventually became Bangladesh, and that separation has created lots of problems, because the Chinese still have that border area with India and Kashmir. There's been 3 wars with India, and there's been numerous skirmishes while we were there. The UN has a large presence there today as well. Let me just say, let me run. I know I'm going to run out of time because this is such a big subject, but this is the capital. The capital of Islamabad has all the embassies of foreign countries. It's called Embassy Row, but it's highly guarded and it's layered. So you get through one fence and then you're into another fence, and it's not quite as easy as you might think to get in there, but then each individual embassy has its own layer of protection too. So they built this city. This was a planned city up against these mountains here. In the background for this, you can see Faisal Mosque. And Faisal Mosque was donated by the Saudi Arabian government. you might know, in Islamabad or in Islam, it's essentially major two sects, the Sunnis and the Shias. And Sunni is the religion of Saudi Arabia. It's a large religion, but there is Shia in Pakistan, but Iran is essentially a Shia nation. So the Saudi king built this, and at the time when they did build this, it was the second largest mosque in the world. Today, I think there's a better picture of it. That was actually a couple blocks from my home for 2 years, and that mosque is quite impressive. The Grand Mosque in Abu Dhabi in UAE is probably the most impressive I've ever seen, but this one is pretty nice, except the regional security officer would not allow us to go in there. So this is an inside view, and if you haven't been in many mosques, and I've been in lots of them, I love the architecture. There is really essentially open, empty space for prayer, and then they usually have some place for preaching, and then the minarets outside, have the call to prayer 5 times a day. So it is pretty structurally beautiful, and there is some great architecture throughout the Islamic world. I mean, just beautiful. Even in Spain, the great Muslim architecture there is impressive. Let me say, having said that, here is the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad. If you're in the capital, I was with a regional medical officer who is a med peds doc, and great guy. He's the physician in Vienna today. His name is Kevin Kilpatrick from Notre Dame. Just a wonderful guy. His son's a West Point grad. His other son's an EOD officer in the Navy. He's a true American guy, but he is going to be my medical officer when we go. He called me and asked if I'd come back to Kabul with him. So he and I will probably be in Kabul for a year after I get out of Burma. This is the embassy that is there today. You don't see the entire compound, but when the Japanese ambassador and medical officer came over, I was giving them a tour, and they said, "Oh my God, this is not an embassy, it's a city." And I said, "Yeah, it's big." The reconstruction project to rebuild the embassy, which completed in 2018, was going on when I was there, cost $1 billion. And while we were doing that, Bechtel and a lot of the companies bought into what's called ICAS. And so I took care of those people as well. And I had a lot of really sick people. I had 3 deaths in the first year I was there. So you can buy into the State Department's medical system if you pay into ICAS, and people are cleared medically to come to countries. So you can't come out with like an active cancer, et cetera, et cetera. But people lie, and then people change. People are in foreign countries and they get physicals that look absolutely perfect. One of the guys that died when I was there was a diabetic using insulin for over 15 years. When I pulled his record to see his clearance, and that he had his physical done in Moldova, and it was perfectly normal, and his lab was stone cold normal. So what you get at post and what you're supposed to have at post are 2 different things. And that, so anyhow, the embassy is beautiful. The ambassador's home sits on the other side from this. David Hale was the ambassador when they opened it up, and it was an impressive place. So let me try to run through let me just try to run through a little bit of Pakistan, the country. We have the capital. The capital has the regional medical officer and the senior medical practitioner. So Kevin and I were there. We take care of Karachi, Lahore, and Peshawar. The history and relationship with Pakistan is extremely complex, considering that the Pakistani Secret Service, IS, was actually harassed me more than the Taliban did. And it was a difficult relationship. But at one time, my ambassador in Mongolia had grown up in Peshawar, and he was actually he said in 30, 40 years ago, it was a wonderful country. You could walk through it, no fear. As a teenager, he would travel through Afghanistan, no problems. That certainly has all changed, and that. So it is a difficult country. If you look, there's been, since 2001, there's been over 30,000 people killed by suicide bombers in Pakistan. While I was there, there was literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of suicide bombings. And 90% of them you never hear. They never get on the news. If it kills a large number of people, you'll hear about it. But the daily ones where somebody blows himself up on a motorcycle never makes the news. When I was in Lahore, lady sat down a briefcase right across from the consulate, and it was in the children's park, and that killed 45 people. 2 weeks later, a guy drove up on a motorcycle, blew himself up, and killed 20-something people. It's a tragedy because the Pakistani people themselves are extremely polite, extremely nice. This is an old world culture. You can't go to anyone's home without being given drinks and food, and they treat their guests like they're royalty. And to see that, and then to see the violence that's in the society, is just, it's difficult to understand. This is my home in Islamabad, and you can see I have concertina wire all around the house. I have barred windows, and you don't see it, but I have a shotgun guard right outside the house. I have a fully metal safe room that has a solid metal door that's locked, and I have 3 radios and that. So I have my med radio, but I have the security officer's radio. And unfortunately, I wound up having to call him quite a few times. And the first time I called him, some guy was standing right up where this gentleman is by the white car with not a Kalashnikov, because Kalashnikovs go off all the time, but with a high-powered handgun, probably a 357 44 caliber, and he was shooting somebody. And when I called the security officer at 2 o'clock in the morning, he goes, how long you been here, son? I said, son, okay, fine. And he said, I've been here for 1.5 years. He goes, okay, I'll be right there. Because people get freaked out about hearing gunshots, but they hear those all the time. But it's quite a bit different when you hear somebody actually shooting at somebody with a high-powered handgun. That goes on a lot. The city itself is beautiful. They have Embassy Row, Constitution Avenue. The buildings are impressive. Wildlife throughout the city, because they're against what's called Magala Hills. The hills have wild boar, which wander down the city. They have monkeys everywhere. So I would see those on a daily basis. And that. So the thing is, it's a police state, and being a police state, you can't enter that city without going through police checkpoints constantly. Now, of course, they get in and people do blow themselves up. The truck that blew up in front of the Marriott there left a 60-foot deep hole and killed over 250 people when it went off. Guy walked into the Christian church that the embassy was having mass at, and threw in a hand grenade and blew himself up, killed a dozen people. The British nurse practitioner who's worked for us for over 22 years at the embassy, Elaine Durrani, had served at all of those events and that. So she had seen it all, trust me. So let me run through
a quick question for you, if you don't
Sure.
mind.
Absolutely.
Before we run out of time, one of the questions that's come up in the chat, which is very interesting, given what's happened this past year with COVID, how are they dealing with COVID, particularly the Americans in the State Department? How is it going to roll out the vaccine for the Americans in these countries, and how does it affect folks like yourself?
That's a great question. And that the COVID issue is dealt with a couple of things. Embassies almost worldwide are in a lockdown mode. Everybody stays home. Only entry into the embassy is if it's critical and necessary. And everybody functions on Zoom, just like this. So we have country team on Zoom. We have town meetings on Zoom, regional meetings, and that. It's all done by Zoom. Certain people can go into the embassy, but they have to go through a procedure. We have PCR. Every single embassy and consulate was given a BioFire PCR, so we can do within 2 hours a PCR, which 95, 98% accuracy for COVID. And we do actually have plans. It's a problem with cold chain, bringing in Pfizer, because it has to be so cold to be brought in. Mondera is not as bad. There's some other vaccines coming out which can actually be room temperature, but there is an active plan for that process.
Good deal. Hopefully, I wanted to make sure anybody else had any other questions, Ben, before we get back to you. Does anybody have any questions for Stu?
My other question on that chat was in regards to, do you see the discrepancy in what the COVID vaccine is going to be rolled out to these other countries that don't have access to, the supplies that we have, the wealth that we have, and how you see that disparity really coming in a worldwide snapshot? And you as a medical professional, are going right back into an environment that is going to see those areas taxed so heavily.
You know, I have to say, to be honest, it really almost has to be addressed a country by country, because everybody has a different supply chain, a different amount of financial resource. Pakistan's pretty well organized. We have a large CDC presence in many of these countries, including Pakistan. And it may be, there's a lot of challenges in poor countries, and part of it is the logistics of getting the vaccine out to the people and actually being able to vaccinate them. And since you brought that up, the one interesting fact is that in Pakistan, because of what happened with bin Laden and the CIA, there's grave reservations about vaccinations or any kind. They actually, everything's a conspiracy, everything. And in Karachi, because polio, there's only 3 countries in the world today that have active polio, and polio is active in Pakistan and that. And so while in Pakistan, the vaccinations were being given, the polio vaccine was being given, the vaccinators, police officers in Karachi, which was their protective detail, they were all killed. And they were killed with the message, the clear message that you can't protect these people. We can get to anybody. And if we can get to the police, we can get to you. And so the vaccinators take a great amount of risk. Now that's Karachi. You know, that's one of the biggest cities in the country, the largest airport, 2 deep water ports, Aga Khan University. Most of Pakistan is tribal, and it's in the mountains, and it's in the Himalayan areas and the border areas of Afghanistan. Getting out there and getting these people vaccinated and all that is just going to be a mammoth undertaking, you know. So Zimbabwe, they had good plans for it, but it's going to be tough, and depends where you're at, you know. So no simple answer.
Well, Stu, thanks so much. I'm sure we could go on for a lot longer, and there'd be other questions, but thanks so much for your time today.
Sure.
And Ben, I'm going to give it back to you now.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Randy. Thank you, Stuart. There's more commentary in the chat room, and there would be more questions for you. Stuart, one quick question. When you were on your last stint, and I think you mentioned it was a 2-year assignment, not a 1-year assignment, how frequently do you get a leave, either to come back to the United States or to travel on your own?
It's a good question. The stress of being out there in these places varies tremendously, and they recognize that. If you're in a high threat post, you may get you can have a spouse with you if it's in a protected area, if they're employed. If you have a spouse with you, you may get out every 6 months. And that happens in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. In most countries, you may get out once a year, and that are once every 2 years. And that depends. If you're in London, they're not going to buy you a ticket to go anywhere. So, but they do pay for airline fares anywhere within a certain area, but they don't pay for anything else. But they will pay for you and your wife's ticket to get out of country on R&R.
Very interesting program.
Okay, can I just say one thing before we finish? This is kind of important. The relationship with Pakistan is huge, and it's huge, and I hadn't gotten a chance to touch on it, but I'm just going to say we flew the U-2 spy planes out of Peshawar over Russia for a long time. And bin Laden ran the Mujahideen, and when the Russians fought in Afghanistan, and he ran and organized the Mujahideen out of Peshawar, Pakistan. It's not ironic that he came back and was in just south of the military academy, and that when we finally tracked him down. The relationship with Pakistan is extremely complex, and it has changed, the relationship with America and the Pakistanis, and they have a huge amount of pressure on them because of the Taliban as well. So it's a very interesting place to be, and 2 years really was almost barely enough to even start to understand it. That's it.
I thought it was very interesting. You mentioned it's a planned city too. And I thought that was something unique to the United States. And it's pretty incredible that it's a very well thought out city.
It is. And there's good reasons for that, because what I have to tell people is we worry about our safety, but the honest truth all throughout the Middle East, and I've been to all the Middle Eastern countries, is it's not us. We are often not the target. It is Muslims killing other Muslims, and so it's the Taliban, the Sunnis, the Shias, the conflict wherever you're at, and it's very deep and it's on many layers. So the real risk is to them, not to us, and they have the police checkpoints everywhere, not for us.
Again, thanks for your service and for your program.
Well, thank you.
Well, there we have it. We're wrapping up our 34th virtual meeting, and we've started 2021. Thanks to all that are here. And I just want to give you a heads up. Next week will be our club assembly meeting. That's when we're going to do a review of what we've accomplished so far as a club in the last 6 months and what we hope to accomplish in the next 6 months. So we're going to do a kind of a pulse on the club. Following that meeting on the 20th is Susan Ritchie. She's going to talk about the Mesa Historical Museum, and that'll be fun. After that, we have an update on oral health, and it'll be from the Center of Advanced Oral Health, and that should be informative and somewhat current thinking there. We have a board meeting on the 12th. That's next week. That's on Tuesday, and look forward to seeing the board members there. This was a great meeting, great day, and I hope if anything, we can notch it up and carry this positive message forward and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Hey, Ben.
For everyone being here. Yes, go ahead.
Ben, I have a news alert for you.
Please
After
do.
the meeting, you might tune into PBS or C-SPAN. Protesters have stormed the Capitol. They have breached the building, and they have disrupted Congress from doing its important work today. I'll say nothing editorial about that, but this is a significant moment, and it deserves everyone's attention.
It certainly does. And though we can't solve anything in this meeting, I think we can at least have solace in knowing that we have a very positive force here among us and the friendships that we share. And I hope that we can use that to cultivate more positivity as we leave this meeting. But I share your concern.
Remember the four-way test.
100%. Thanks, Chaz. Everybody be safe and have a safe afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Good meeting, man.